Hi everyone, K-Dot here. This week I'm going to talk a bit about one of the custom races that I've created that I use in my campaign setting. This race calls themselves by many different names, but most other normal people would know them as True Elves. They are a sub-race or subspecies, or depending on who you talk to and ask, the progenitor of the other elven races that exist in D&D and Pathfinder. So this video is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to talk about some basic rules for this race and some of the mechanics that go along with playing them, just because that kind of thing happens when you describe a new player character race. And all of the actual detailed information for that will be in links in the description below to a GM Binder page for 5th edition and a GM Binder page for Pathfinder stuff, and another GM Binder page for more lore and history stuff, which I will cover in the second part of this, which will be the latter half of this video. So it's not just one race that I'm going to be talking about, it's actually two races. There's the True Elves, and then there's the Half-True Elves. The Half-True Elves are actually really simple. I'll include them briefly at the end. They should be pretty easy for anyone to deal with. Again, rules will be in the GM Binder links in the description below. So what are True Elves in brief? Just so that you can kind of get an idea for what your character will look like and how they'll act and function and that kind of stuff. True Elves are really difficult to distinguish from normal elves. They look a lot like all of the other elf races. They actually can take on the coloration, like skin tone and hair colors, and even the attitude and bearing of any of the other elf races that are out there. There are True Elves that take on the skin color and hair color of everything from the High Elves to the Drow. The True Elves also have personality traits that range from the most paragon of paragon to the most cruel and sadistic beings that you could imagine. They are perfect for both the hero of the group and the big bad guy at the end of the game. As far as physical differences go, True Elves are much, much taller than a regular elf. On average, they're about a head taller. I say they're between 6 and 7.5 feet tall, typically. I still count them as medium-sized just because they're still based on the normal elf template, but typically they're said to be really tall. They're also more solidly built than other elves. They don't have the same frailty that those other elves have. They are just as fast and just as coordinated as other elves are. So as far as stats go, I usually say that True Elves get that +2 to Dex that all elves get. For Pathfinder, this would be all that they would get, because in the Pathfinder rules you typically have one stat that gets a +2, and then you have another stat that gets a +2, and then a third that gets a -2 for at least the core races. In 5th edition, most of the other sub-races of elves get an additional +1 to another ability score of their choice, so for 5th edition I say the True Elves get that +2 to Dex and then +1 to one of their choice, because they take after any and all of the other elf races, so they get a little bit of flexibility when it comes to how they're going to distribute their bonuses to their stats initially when a character is created. Another thing that you will notice really quickly with True Elves is that their attitude will not necessarily match their looks. This is a thing that comes up often in D&D, where you see a drow and typically it is an evil character that has lots of machinations and plans within plans and is looking to take over the world and conquer things, because drow are an evil race and they are looking to do all of those things. With the True Elves, they may look like one particular type of elf, just taller and more sturdy, but they certainly may not act like that other kind of elf. They can have any of the personalities and attitudes that any of the other elf races might possibly have. I don't want to limit myself, and I don't want to limit players to say, okay, well, if your True Elf looks like a drow, then they have to act like that. I disagree with that. I do the same when my player characters come to me and say, well, I want to play a drow, but I don't want to play an evil drow. that's just my DM style. I won't really go too much into that here. There are two sort of personality quirks that many true elves have, talking about these personality types. The first of these is the true elves tend to have a lot of secrets, and they tend to not want to share those secrets with others. This can make playing a true elf a little bit difficult because they don't necessarily want to share their secrets with their other members of the party. That's not to say that they won't talk and laugh and be merry when the time is right. It's just that they're not going to easily confess their secrets, their knowledge that they may have, to other party members unless those party members are true elves. And even then, they still may not want to share their secrets, because if the true elf is from another house than theirs, then those secrets might be for the house and not for this other true elf from a different family who may or may not actually be an ally of the player character in question. The second personality quirk that most true elves have is that they have a reputation that they uphold for enjoying violence. This gives them a natural affinity to intimidate people, including other true elves. They don't necessarily enjoy it in a sadistic way, they just find the act of violence to be somewhat natural to them. It is a lesson that was kind of learned by their species and culture longer ago than really anyone can remember. So they have this reputation for being able to do violence to other creatures, and they uphold it. Part of the way that they uphold this reputation for violence is with their one true defining characteristic that makes them very different from other elf races. This characteristic is really only visible if they open their mouth, and since they really like to hold their peace, hold their tongue, and listen more than talk, it can sometimes be hard to tell if you're interacting with a true elf or just a particularly tall regular elf. This characteristic is that every true elf has a set of double fangs, 8 very sharp, elongated teeth in their mouth that are very visible if they smile too wide or laugh out loud. Again, true elves being a little bit more reserved than others, particularly around strangers, these are going to be something that's hard to notice, fairly easy for them to conceal as well. So if you see these fangs, especially if there's more than one set of them, you're definitely dealing with a true elf, not necessarily a vampire or some other sort of a weird half something or mutation of something. These fangs do give true elves a bite attack that they can use. It causes a minor amount of damage. The real thing with these fangs is that it allows the true elf to deliver a hallucinogenic poison that is produced in venom glands in their neck to a target that they bite. This poison does a little bit of wisdom damage. It's not anything permanent, it's not anything major. The bite attack is not anything that many true elves will even be proficient with using in combat unless they specifically work at it. So taking a feat or having a class ability that gives them proficiency with a bite attack specifically. So that kind of wraps up the rules of the true elves. So let's move on to the half-true elves. They're actually really simple. Take the half-elf template, the half-elf character race from the core rulebook or the player's handbook or whatever source you're going to go with, and give them a minor bite attack. That's it. That's all they have. They are a basic half-elf. They can do a little bit of damage if they can hit with a bite attack naturally. Again, the bite attack is not something that they're going to be naturally proficient with unless they have a class feature or a feat that specifically gives them that proficiency. Otherwise, that's the only real difference. So, all of these sorts of rules will be detailed in the description in GM Binder links that I have posted below. Now, on to the more fun part, which is kind of the lore and the fluff and the stuff about their culture and all of that kind of thing. And this is where things kind of can go a little bit off the rails. There's a lot of stuff that I treat as a DM as sort of true that not every DM may want to treat this as 100% true because the sources may be unreliable in some way. So I'm going to kind of describe how some of these things are easy to verify, some of these things are difficult to verify, and some of these things are going to be impossible to verify. And any GM that decides to use this kind of stuff in their own campaigns can run with it as much as they want, and they can either use this as the True Elves are playing it straight and are 100% above the board and all of this is true, or they're making up half-truths and keeping these secrets for a particular reason, and that can be either sinister or not so sinister, however it wants to be played out. So the True Elves are a pretty big staple within the city of Axiom. It is fairly obvious for anyone that spends any amount of time in this endless city that there are probably more True Elves out there than there are any other race in Axiom as a general number as far as size of population. This is simply because the True Elves are described as taking up between 5 and 25% of the population in any given city section within Axiom, with very few exceptions. Those exceptions being in areas that are claimed by other elf races. The True Elves are going to potentially be upwards of 35 to 50% of the actual population, just because True Elves tend to associate with other elf races a little bit more easily than they do with the shorter-lived races like dwarves, humans, gnomes, orcs, those kinds of things. The other exception to this would be if there was a city section like described in the city section of Clearwater, where the local populace is somewhat hostile to outsiders or other races of any kind. In that case, the True Elves will have much less of a population density in that city section. Those kinds of city sections are a little bit more rare, but again, that kind of thing does happen within Axiom. It's a very large place. There's plenty of room for both of those situations to happen. At the end of the day, though, it kind of balances out where it's between 15 and about 25% of the population is True Elves. This discussion of kind of numbers and you know how many of them are there and percentages brings us to the first and pretty easily verifiable fact about the True Elves. There's a lot of them. They are quite strong as far as population goes. They are very powerful, and they can do a lot of things if they so desire. As a race, they would potentially be capable of conquering large swaths of the city of Axiom, and yet they haven't. Without too much of a leap of logic, it is also pretty easy to determine that the True Elves have been around Axiom as long as anyone can imagine. This explains why their population is so spread out throughout all of these city sections. It does not explain why they don't actually claim any of the city sections for their own. I'll get to that in a minute. It is certainly indicative of the fact that they have been in and known about Axiom for a very long time. So why haven't they actually claimed a city section like many other races will claim a city section, like, let's say, the humans in Clearwater or in White Pillar or the dwarves in Iron Rock Hold? Why haven't the True Elves done this? Well, this has to do with where they come from. The True Elves all seem to come from, or at least they all claim to come from, one city, one elf realm called Lorthian. Lorthian is rumored to be extremely interconnected with Axiom as far as portals go. It is said that 99% of these portals are so well hidden that most people would never find them. But if you have that many portals over as large a space as Axiom takes up, that 1% is still a large number that people might accidentally stumble across. And the rumors of somebody accidentally walking into a broom closet in some random abandoned house somewhere and coming out into this lush forested area and suddenly being surrounded by very tall, very angry true elves demanding that they leave this place and that they are trespassing, that happens just enough for people to be suspicious of just how connected is the city of Lorthian. It doesn't take too much of a leap of logic from hearing these kinds of rumors to start to get the feeling that Lorthian is so well connected to Axiom that the two things may just be two sides of the same coin, almost. It's really impossible to 100% confirm this because nobody actually knows who created Axiom. Even the True Elves don't claim to know why Axiom exists and who made it, because it is a construct. It's not a naturally occurring dimension. Somebody did create this place. It's too normal for it to have occurred naturally. The True Elves do claim that they have created their city of Lorthian in the image of Axiom, just as an elf city rather than as a city. The difference being, at least in my head, that elf cities tend to be a lot more natural. They tend to blend in with the natural world around them. They tend to look more like a forest until you suddenly realize that all of the trees around you have been grown into these elaborate shapes, and they are the buildings. So it's just kind of a difference in style as opposed to a difference in purpose. So I touched very briefly on the fact that everybody knows that the True Elves have been here a long time. Well, how long is a long time? The answer to this is nobody really knows. The True Elves claim that they have been in Axiom since before any other race that has existed. They actually claim to be one of the first sentient thinking races to come about. This is unverifiable. Sentient and thinking races have been around longer than records exist. They've been around longer than any individual creature or deity has existed. Nobody can say for certain whether or not the True Elves are as ancient as they say they are. As far as how I play this off when I'm doing the DMing, I definitely tend to play this pretty straight. Yes, the True Elves are in fact that ancient. And this then plays into some of their other claims that they make. The big one being that True Elves, almost all True Elves, claim to be the progenitor of all of the other elf races that exist in all of the other dimensions. And that these other elf races that split off from them at some point in the distant past have lost some of whatever it is that makes the True Elves so powerful. And so that's why they're shorter, that's why they don't have as much magic, that's why they don't understand how to manipulate dimensional barriers like the True Elves can do. So let's talk about that briefly. True Elves are masters of dimensional magic. They understand how to build more of the portals that connect Axiom to all of the other worlds and other planes and dimensions and places that Axiom is connected to. They are one of the reasons why Axiom is so well connected with not just Lorthian, but everywhere else, because typically people will pay the True Elves to make that permanent portal because it's a heck of a lot easier to pay somebody else to do it than to get all the materials and do all the magical research yourself to have it done. Another thing is that it's really hard to figure out how to use these dimensional magics. They are not something that's common in my realms unless the portal is already there, right? So the True Elves have this secret and they don't necessarily like to share it. This is one of those secrets that they tend to guard fairly jealously. If they know how to walk between the barriers of dimensions, they're not going to tell that to just anyone. You have to know the right people, have the right favors owed to you, and even in many cases know the right questions to ask to even learn that they know this kind of knowledge. So as far as how long the True Elves have been around, that's really hard to determine. You can also ask the question, well, how old do True Elves get? That's another really difficult question to answer, because there are some True Elves that many people claim have always been around. Most people, even other elves that aren't True Elves, seem to think that most True Elves are pretty much immortal as long as they don't get grievously wounded in some way. Again, this is something that is truly impossible to verify and confirm because the only beings that could do it would be the True Elves themselves, but it's definitely another sort of a flavor thing that I like to throw in when I'm running True Elf NPCs. The True Elves are ruled by a single monarch, a queen. Her name is Lady Loranalsa, also known as the Lady Lorana. She has been in charge of the True Elves for as long as there is record of them. Even longer than there is record of the True Elves in any other race. The True Elves themselves claim that she is absolutely immortal and that she's been around since the beginning of time, and they can do that. There's really no way to verify that. If you know the right people and ask the right questions and maybe have the right favors owed to you, you might be able to, as long as you trust these sources that are telling you this information, figure out that she's more than 10,000 years old. And yet she still looks like an elf who is not terribly young, but not terribly old either. What is known about her is that she is an intensely powerful magic user, and that her specialty in this realm is that of illusion and glamour. Her magic and her illusions seem to be so powerful that in many cases it is difficult to tell if what you're seeing when you are in her presence is actually reality or if it is just some sort of a construct that she has created that she wants you to see. Even the people who say that they know her and claim that she is their friend are unsure of what is illusion around her and what isn't, because she is, in fact, that powerful. Other sort of really wild and out there things that I like to kind of play straight because I think they're fun and add some really interesting dynamics when I run a campaign, and if my players ever, decide to go and visit the True Elves somehow and meet their queen, I like to have her claim to personally know whatever elf deities that the other elf players tend to worship, and ask them that the next time that you talk to so-and-so deity, Coralon or whoever, please tell him hi for me because he was such a lovely child all those years ago. Those kinds of things. Again, this is not something that anyone would actually be able to potentially confirm unless you were at the stage of a campaign where you were actually dealing with gods, but it's definitely sort of a flavor that I like to throw in there. And it also kind of plays off the whole, oh, the True Elves are the progenitors of all of these other elf races, and by the way, their queen knows all of the elf gods and knew them before they were gods when they were just young little true elflings. So I've kind of talked a lot about all of these sort of rumors and the True Elves being this impressively ancient and powerful race, and so I kind of have based the True Elves off of how I picture the Sidhe and the An Sidhe, also the Seelie and the Unseelie from the Fae, in our own myths and legends. I really wanted an elf race that was this super powerful, sort of unapproachable, grand, and even potentially huge evil entity that I could use in my campaigns. I tend to keep them more neutral than evil, especially because I really have never had the opportunity to really go into all of the reasons that the True Elves do the things that they do, and some of them I've thought about and many of them I haven't, just because the scope of what I've done over the last 20 years of making this campaign setting has been such that I've only had time to think a little bit about a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about here. So again, these are the Sidhe and the An Sidhe. This is where these legends come from in the realities that I deal with in my campaign settings. And this is also where their love of violence comes from as well, because if you know anything about the legends that we have about these elves that I have been inspired by, frequently they are tricksters and evil and cruel in some way, shape, or form. And so, of course, my elves are going to have that kind of thing, those kinds of personality traits, those kinds of behaviors with themselves as well. So I think that I've rambled on for about as long as I can with this here this week. This one has been a long time coming, and it's taken a lot of tries to get this video right. So I hope that everybody enjoyed it. As always, I hope that everyone has a wonderful week ahead of them. If you have the ability to, I hope that you can go out, have some fun, play some games, do something cool, and please try to remember, be excellent to everyone around you. It'll make the world so much better for everybody else. Thanks so much. Have a good week.